The last time Caleb saw his mother, she was reaching for the door of a gas station in a rusted red sedan with one headlight out. The engine coughed and sputtered like it was dying. She'd pressed a 20 into his palm and said, 20 minutes, tops. Just got to make a call and grab something. Her smile had tried too hard. Her eyes hadn't matched it. Then she was gone. That had been over a year ago. Now 11-year-old Caleb stood in the same jeans he'd worn that day, the knees threadbare and crusted with dirt. His backpack, a school-issued one with someone else's name written in Sharpie, held a single shirt, 2 granola bars, and a note he could no longer bring himself to read. He hadn't cried when the sun set behind the station. He'd waited exactly 20 minutes, then 30, then 2 hours. The woman at the register had started asking questions. Caleb had slipped out through the back door before they could call anyone. The next night, he slept behind a dumpster behind a fried chicken place. It reeked of grease and old gravy. That was where he met Ranger. The mutt came out of the shadows without sound, one ear chewed to ribbons and eyes sharp as broken glass. Thin, angular, and cautious. Caleb had frozen, unsure if he should run. But the dog didn't lunge, didn't growl, just stared. Caleb reached into his backpack, broke off a corner of a stale granola bar, and held it out. "You hungry too?" he whispered. The dog inched forward, took it gently. That was the beginning. In the weeks that followed, they moved like ghosts, through trailer parks, under bridges, behind shuttered diners. Caleb learned to recognize which gas stations wouldn't ask questions if he used the bathroom too long. Ranger learned which trash bins had meat. When people talked to them, Caleb lied with ease. "Dad's up ahead. My mum's waiting in the car." He became invisible by being forgettable, but the world wasn't kind to boys with dirty hands and wild eyes, or to dogs with scars and ribs showing. So when he overheard 2 truckers talking about abandoned land up near the ridge, "Old moonshiner's place, no one goes up there since the fire?" A plan began to form. It was Ranger who led them. They moved deeper into the hills, slipping through woods that grew denser with every mile. Caleb followed streams upstream, looking for signs no one had been there, no beer cans, no fire pits. The forest stopped humming with people. Only birds now. The wind. The quiet crunch of paws ahead of him. They found the cabin 3 days later. It didn't look like much. A porch that sagged like a snapped spine. Windows without glass. A chimney cracked open near the top. But it had walls. A roof, mostly. And it didn't ask where he came from. Caleb approached it slowly, his sneakers soaked from creek water. Ranger padded beside him, head low, ears turning with every sound. The door hung open on one hinge. Caleb pushed it wider. It groaned like something, ancient, waking up. Inside it smelled of mice, smoke, and rot. The floor was warped and scattered with fallen plaster. A fireplace dominated one wall. In a corner, a collapsed cot. But Caleb wasn't thinking about the mold. He was thinking about not sleeping in the dirt. Ranger sniffed every inch of the place, tail stiff. In one corner, he growled low and sharp. "What is it?" Caleb crouched beside him. A rat scurried out from under the floorboards. Ranger lunged, jaws snapping. "Missed!" Caleb laughed. The sound startled even him. "Don't worry, you'll get the next one," he said, patting the dog's bony side. In the shed behind the cabin, he found a rusted hammer with no handle grip and a coffee can full of bent nails. A tarp lay balled up beneath some rotted boards. He dragged it inside, covering the part of the roof that leaked the worst. It wouldn't hold long, but it was better than nothing. By sunset, he had a small fire going in the fireplace, even if the smoke only half escaped through the busted chimney. He and Ranger curled together under the tarp, listening to the wind press against the walls like a stranger knocking. Caleb didn't sleep. Not really. Every creak made him startle. He kept waiting for headlights, for voices, for someone to say, "Hey kid, this ain't yours." But no one came. Rain started just after midnight, soft at first, then harder. Caleb shifted closer to Ranger, felt the dog's ribs under his hand. The cabin creaked but held. In the grey light of morning, with mist curling like breath over the forest floor, Caleb stood on the sagging porch. The place was falling apart, but something inside him, something deeper than logic, said, "Stay." Not because it was safe, but because it was the first place that hadn't tried to send him away. "I think this is home now," he told Ranger. The dog looked up, blinked once, then walked back inside without waiting for permission. That was all the answer he needed. And just like that, the boy who had no one, and the dog who had nothing left, began to build something neither of them had ever known: a reason to stay. The first morning in the cabin tasted like smoke and metal. The fire from last night had died sometime before dawn, leaving only the ghost of heat in the ashes. Caleb sat up, his breath visible in the cold air, and watched Ranger pacing near the door, head tilted, ears twitching. The dog wasn't restless. He was listening. Outside, the forest was a patchwork of fog and silence, the kind that swallowed footsteps. When Ranger pushed the door open with his nose, Caleb followed, wrapping his arms tight around himself. He had no plan beyond this morning, no food left. The air smelled like pine and rain. Then Ranger froze, tail rigid. Caleb followed his gaze toward the tree line. A copperhead snake coiled on a rock, motionless except for the slow flick of its tongue. Caleb hadn't seen it until Ranger lunged, barking, startling the snake into retreat. His growl was low, protective, primal. Caleb's heart pounded. "Okay," he whispered, voice trembling. "You saw it before I did. You win." From that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was trust, built not from words, but instincts aligning. They spent the next days exploring the woods like scavengers in a forgotten kingdom. Ranger led the way, his nose always a step ahead. He sniffed out a stream half a mile downhill, clean enough to drink after Caleb figured out how to boil it in an old tin can he'd found in the ashes of the cabin's fireplace. He learned to start fires by sparking 2 rusted nails together and catching the ember with dry moss. It took hours at first. His hands blistered. He cursed, cried once, then laughed when the flame finally caught. He found an old oil lamp behind the hearth, half filled with cloudy kerosene. When he lit it that night, the flicker of yellow light filled the small cabin with something that felt close to warmth. Ranger lay curled near the fire, muzzle resting on his paws, eyes half open as if he didn't quite trust sleep. Caleb whispered into the silence, "You think this place could be home?" Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. That was enough. By the end of the week, Caleb had mapped the forest around them. He carved small marks into trees to remember safe paths. He built a crude rack for drying meat after finding a rabbit snared in a fallen branch trap. Its death was accidental, but the meal was deliberate. The smell of roasting meat filled the cabin for the first time, smoky and sharp. Caleb divided it evenly, setting half in a tin plate before Ranger. The dog didn't lunge. He waited for a nod, then ate, slow and grateful. The nights were long. Coyotes howled from far ridges, and sometimes Ranger's ears would twitch, but he wouldn't move. Caleb would stare into the dying fire, feeling the walls of the cabin like an anchor around him. It wasn't comfort, not yet, but it was shelter. Then, on the 9th night, something changed. Ranger started barking at nothing, low, rhythmic barks that echoed into the trees. Caleb grabbed the oil lamp and stepped onto the porch, heart hammering. Out beyond the edge of light, a shadow moved. He saw eyes, not yellow like a deer's reflection, closer, wider. "Bear!" Caleb whispered. Before he could move, the creature stepped into view. A black bear, lean and desperate after a long winter. Ranger stood at the edge of the porch, shoulders low, growling deep. The bear huffed, taking another step forward. "Don't!" Caleb hissed, voice shaking. "Please don't!" The bear lunged once, more bluff than charge, but Ranger was already moving. He bolted forward, barking so furiously the sound tore through the night. Caleb didn't think. He grabbed a burning stick from the fire pit and waved it wildly. Sparks flew. The bear hesitated, snarled, and turned back into the woods. Silence returned, broken only by Caleb's uneven breathing. Ranger came back limping, a small gash on his shoulder where claws had grazed him. Caleb tore the sleeve off his own shirt and pressed it against the wound, whispering, "You stupid, brave thing, you saved me." Ranger didn't flinch. He just looked at him with eyes that were tired but certain, as if to say it wasn't bravery. It was duty. That night, Caleb didn't sleep at all. He watched the firelight dance across the walls and thought of how close they'd come to being wiped from the map of the world without anyone ever knowing they existed. And yet, in that moment of silence after chaos, he felt something else, something small but solid take root inside him. The next morning, when the rain stopped, he stepped outside with a different kind of purpose. The forest no longer felt like a cage, it felt like a test. He began reinforcing the cabin walls, collecting rocks from the stream to patch holes, using mud as mortar. He hung the oil lamp from a nail near the door, its faint smell of kerosene mixing with pine sap. The roof still leaked, but less now. The place was ugly, crooked, and half-rotten. But when he and Ranger stood inside at dusk, watching the fire flicker against the wood, it looked like possibility. Ranger lifted his head and gave a quiet, satisfied huff, curling beside the fire. Caleb leaned back against the wall, feeling his heartbeat slow. For the first time since his mother drove away, the silence didn't scare him. It sounded like belonging. The morning after the bear, everything felt sharper. Colors, sounds, even the chill in the air. Caleb woke to frost clinging to the inside of the window frame, his breath clouding the stillness. Ranger stirred beside him, his shoulder wound, cleaned and bound, though he still moved with a slight limp. Caleb reached down and rested a hand on his side. "We can't stay like this," he said aloud. "This place needs to work, or we won't make it." And so the real work began. The cabin, barely standing, was more ruin than refuge. Caleb started with the roof, using the torn tarp he'd salvaged from behind the shed to cover the largest leak. He weighed it down with rocks and wired it to the rotting beams, using vines twisted into rough cords. It held, sort of. Water still found ways in, but not directly over their heads anymore. Next came the floor. Caleb cleared out the broken furniture, dragging splintered wood and mildew-covered cushions outside. Ranger barked at a rat that shot from beneath a board, and Caleb flinched, then laughed. Let's call that progress. Days passed in a rhythm neither of them had known before. Wake with the light, check the stream, forage, gather wood, patch holes, sleep, repeat. But it was never enough. One cold morning, while following Ranger deeper into the trees, Caleb saw something strange beneath a tangle of mountain laurel, a rust-colored hulk almost swallowed by the forest. An old truck. It sat half-sunken into the ground, vines growing through the wheel wells, the back filled with dead leaves and old pine needles. The windshield was cracked, moss-covered. It looked like it had been there for years. But when Caleb yanked open the driver's side door, what he found made his chest tighten. A toolbox. Inside, a rusted handsaw with half its teeth intact, a pair of pliers, coils of wire, 2 screwdrivers, a folding knife missing one scale but still sharp. Underneath, a length of rope, a dented thermos, and, his breath caught, a hatchet. Ranger barked once, tail wagging furiously. Caleb sat back on his heels, eyes wide. It wasn't treasure. It was survival. It took him 3 trips to carry everything back. The rope alone felt like a miracle, strong, braided, still flexible. He used it to reinforce the tarp, then to string up a rack for drying food near the fire. The hatchet he used to split wood properly for the first time. It changed everything. No more hacking at branches with a rusty nail. Now they had leverage, control, and the saw, though dulled by time, let him cut boards from fallen trees to shore up the cabin walls. Each nailed plank felt like a declaration. This place belongs to us now. Caleb began drawing in the margins of a battered notebook he'd found behind the fireplace. A map. At first, just the stream and cabin. Then the game trails. The berry patch Ranger sniffed out near a fallen log, the overhang where owls nested, and the ridge with the best view of the sunrise. He used charcoal and bits of pencil lead. Each night he added more, always with Ranger curled beside him. One afternoon, while digging a trench to divert rainwater from the porch, Caleb struck something hard beneath the soil. At first he thought it was rock, but after brushing dirt away, he uncovered a rusted pipe that led off downhill. A catchment system, maybe, or the remnants of an old gutter. Inspired, Caleb dragged the rest of the tarp he'd found in the truck out of the leaves and strung it at an angle from the roof, funneling runoff into an old cooking pot he'd found behind the cabin. After the next rain, it was nearly full. He tasted the water. Clean. Cold. And it tasted like a win. Ranger stood beside the pot, tongue lolling, and Caleb let him drink first. "We're not just surviving anymore," he said. "We're doing something better." That night, he lit the oil lamp and stared at the map he'd sketched. There were still blank spots, still unknowns. He didn't like that. So he added symbols, little stars for safe places, X's for danger, dots for tracks. The bear's path was marked. So was the ridge with loose shale, where he'd slipped and nearly twisted his ankle. Information became defense. He even added a small square to the corner of the map and wrote the word fort. Not cabin, not shack. Fort. It wasn't just about protection anymore. It was about building something. The next morning, Caleb fashioned a crude fence from saplings, tying them together with vine and wire. It wouldn't stop a bear, but it kept raccoons from digging through the compost, and it made the place look lived in. Claimed. When a storm hit 3 days later, wind shrieking through the trees, they were ready. Caleb had tied the tarp so tight it barely flapped. He moved everything inside, sealed the broken window with a board, and waited. The cabin creaked, but it didn't leak. The fire burned steady. Ranger curled at the door, nose pointed outward like a sentry. Caleb sipped warm water from the thermos and watched the flames. For the first time, the storm didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a wall outside their fortress. He looked down at Ranger, whose eyes flicked toward him just once before returning to the door. "Good job," Caleb whispered. It wasn't just a thank you. It was something bigger. He didn't say it aloud yet, but he knew. They were building a life here. One scavenged board, one fire-lit night, one shared breath at a time. The first snow came like a whisper, soft and harmless, just a dusting that melted by noon. But by the 3rd week of December, the whisper had become a roar. The wind howled down from the ridges, tearing through the trees like a living thing. Caleb had never known cold like this, the kind that burned before it froze. He woke one morning to silence so heavy it made his ears ring. The world outside had disappeared under a white ocean. The door to the cabin wouldn't budge when he tried to open it. Snow had drifted waist-high against it. He shoved, shoulder screaming, until it cracked open just enough for light to spill in. The sight made him stop. Everything, the trees, the fence, the path to the stream, was gone, buried. Ranger pushed past him, leaping into the snow and vanishing almost completely. When he popped his head up again, his fur was dusted white, eyes bright with excitement. Caleb almost laughed until the roof above them groaned. He looked up just as a beam gave way. The collapse was fast and brutal. Wood, snow, and shards of tarp crashed down. Caleb dove to the side, but too late. Something slammed into his leg, pain flashing white-hot. He shouted, trying to pull free, but the weight pinned him. Ranger barked wildly, trying to dig at the snow. "Ranger, stop! I'm okay, just wait!" But he wasn't okay. His right leg was trapped under the edge of a broken board, a nail buried deep into his thigh. Blood bloomed through his torn jeans. Panic hit him hard, his breath ragged in the freezing air. He grabbed at the board, pulling until the nail tore loose, and pain shot up like lightning. He screamed, then collapsed backward, vision spinning. When he woke again, the fire was out, and the cold had settled into his bones. Ranger was lying across his chest, his body heavy and warm. The dog's fur smelled of smoke and pine. When Caleb tried to move, Ranger whined softly but didn't get up. Instead, he nudged the boy's hand toward something on the floor, a small pile of twigs. Caleb blinked. The dog had gathered wood. With shaking hands, he struck the flint, coaxing a spark into flame. It caught, weak but real. The light filled the cabin with a soft, trembling glow. Ranger pressed close, sharing his heat. Over the next 2 days, time dissolved into a blur of pain, fever, and sleep. Caleb drifted in and out, sometimes dreaming he was back at the gas station, his mother's car idling, her voice saying she'd be right back. When he woke, the only sound was the crackle of fire and Ranger's breathing. The dog had found ways to survive without him. Caleb realized that when he saw the rabbit carcass near the door, half covered in snow. Ranger had dragged it from somewhere out in the storm. He'd also brought back scraps of bark stripped clean of snow, dry kindling. Caleb didn't know how far the dog had gone or how he'd found anything alive in the blizzard. But each time he woke, there was something new by the fire. Food, water, hope. By the 4th day, the storm began to ease. Caleb's leg throbbed, but the bleeding had stopped. He propped himself against the wall, grimacing. Ranger lay at his feet, paws raw from the cold, muzzle speckled with frost. "You saved me," Caleb whispered. His throat was dry, voice hoarse. "You actually saved me." Ranger lifted his head, eyes half-lidded, as if to say, "That's what I'm for." The next morning, Caleb heard something strange through the thin walls, voices, distant, muffled but human. He froze. For the first time in months, someone was out there. He crawled to the window and wiped the frost away with his sleeve. Through the haze of trees, he saw movement. 3 figures in heavy jackets, bright orange against the snow. They carried poles and radios. A search party. His pulse hammered. They'd found him. Somehow someone had tracked him here. Maybe the rabbit bones, the smoke, the footprints. He didn't know. He just knew that if they took him back, the cabin, the life he and Ranger built, would be gone. He grabbed Ranger by the collar. "Quiet," he whispered. "Please, don't bark." Ranger stayed still, but his ears twitched, nostrils flaring. The men's voices drifted closer. Then one of them shouted, "She can't be far! Tracks head east!" She. Caleb's stomach twisted. They weren't looking for him. They were searching for someone else. A lost hiker, maybe, or a missing camper. For a moment, he didn't know if he felt relieved or guilty. Someone else was in danger out there. He wanted to call out. But his body wouldn't move, and his leg was too weak to stand. The men's voices faded into the distance. Silence returned. He leaned his head back against the wall, the weight of realization pressing on him. He'd been hiding so long that even rescue sounded like a threat. But in that quiet, something else settled in. A strange, new certainty. Survival wasn't just about running anymore. It was about staying, building, protecting what they had made. That night, as the last of the storm cleared, the moonlight spilled through the broken roof, silvering the cabin's interior. Ranger lay beside him, snoring softly. Caleb reached over and rested his hand on the dog's neck, feeling the steady thump of his heart. Outside, the forest breathed again. The storm was over, but something inside him had changed forever. He wasn't waiting for anyone to come anymore. He already had someone who did. The last of the snow melted slowly, clinging stubbornly to the shaded hollows behind the cabin. But spring was finally here. The air carried a different scent now, wet earth, sap, and something electric. Caleb could feel it in his bones. After months of cold and silence, the forest had begun to stir. Buds swelled on the tips of branches, birdsong returned, and even the creek had a stronger voice as melted snow rushed down from the ridges. Caleb leaned on the crutch he'd fashioned during his recovery and limped out to the side of the cabin, Ranger following close. His legs still ached, especially in the morning, but he could move again. Every step was a victory. He knelt slowly beside the porch, brushing away dead leaves and brittle pine needles. He was clearing debris when he heard it, the metallic rattle of something hidden. Curious, he dug carefully with his fingers until they hit a hard corner. A small tin box. Rusted shut. He took it inside and pried it open with the tip of his knife. Inside, seeds. Dozens of tiny paper envelopes, each carefully labeled in fading handwriting. Beans, carrots, lettuce, squash, even corn. A few bore years scrawled in the corner. Some were 5, maybe 6 years old. He stared at them, heart thudding. Someone used to live here, he whispered. Someone had plans. He held one of the packets up to the light. Most kids wouldn't get excited about seeds, but to Caleb, they were more than plants. They were proof that things could grow out of ruin, that this place, this home, could be more than survival. The next morning, he and Ranger set to work. He chose a south-facing patch of land near the porch, where the sun lingered longest. The ground was still wet but soft. Caleb used the rusted shovel he'd found months ago in the truck's bed and turned the soil. Worms wriggled free, and Ranger chased them with mock ferocity. "You're not helping," Caleb said, laughing for the first time in weeks. He marked rows with twine and broken sticks. It wasn't pretty, but it was organized. He read every instruction on the packets twice. Plant 1 inch deep, space 6 inches apart, water daily. He followed it all like a sacred ritual. Days passed and nothing happened. He watered the soil using a tin coffee can, carried from the creek or collected from the rain barrels. Each morning he knelt and checked for signs of life. Each evening he spoke to Ranger like an anxious parent, waiting for news. "You think they'll grow?" Ranger would tilt his head, tail wagging. On the 10th day, Caleb saw it. A tiny green sprout poking through the soil. He dropped to his knees, heart racing. It was so small, so fragile. But it was there, alive. It hadn't come from the woods or been scavenged from the wreckage. He had made it. "We planted that," he said softly. "We made that happen." More sprouts followed. Soon the patch of dirt was dotted with green. Some shoots were crooked. Others came up in clumps where Caleb had misjudged spacing. It didn't matter. It was his. The garden became a rhythm. Mornings were for watering, afternoons for building. He constructed a crude trellis for beans and reinforced the fence to keep deer away. Ranger stood watch, ever alert, even chasing off a raccoon one night with a bark so fierce it echoed down the valley. As the garden flourished, something in Caleb shifted. He found himself walking slower through the trees, noticing things he'd missed in winter. The way the light filtered through new leaves, the tiny insects rebuilding their own shelters. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was part of something. One evening, after planting the last of the squash, Caleb sat on the porch, his legs stretched out in front of him, Ranger curled at his side. The sun dipped below the ridge, painting the sky in orange and violet. Caleb held a journal in his lap, flipping through the pages. It was full now. Maps, sketches, plans, questions, notes about medicinal plants, shelter designs, firewood tricks. But lately, something else had crept into the margins. Questions. Is this legal? If I get hurt again, who helps? If I die here, does anyone even know I existed? He looked out over the garden. The rows were crooked but thriving. His cabin still leaned slightly, but it held. His leg was healing. His dog was aging, and he was still a ghost in the system. They'd come once, the search team, and though it hadn't been for him, it was a reminder. The world was still out there, and sooner or later it would come knocking. The idea had taken root like the seeds beneath the soil. What if I didn't have to hide? He'd read about emancipation laws, adverse possession, survival hearings, all concepts jotted into his journal. Maybe, just maybe, he could prove he belonged here. Not just as a runaway, but as a resident, a builder, someone who'd made something out of nothing. But going back into the world meant risk. It meant they'd ask about his mother, about how he'd survived, about why he never came forward. It meant exposure. He looked down at Ranger, now asleep with his nose tucked under his tail. The dog had been his anchor through every storm, every hunger pang, every long night. They'd built this life together. And if he stepped out of the shadows, there was no guarantee he could protect it. Still, he couldn't ignore the truth anymore. He wanted more than survival. He wanted rights, recognition, a future. He wanted to be seen. The next morning, Caleb pulled out a clean page in his journal and began writing. Not a map, not a plan, but a statement. My name is Caleb Rivers. I am 16 years old. I've lived here in these mountains for almost 5 years. I have no official records, no address, no guardian. But I am not lost. I am not broken. I have built something here. I deserve to be part of the world, not just survive in its shadows. He stopped and reread the words. His heart beat faster, like it knew the truth of what he was doing. Then he closed the book and looked out over the garden again. Everything that grew had once been buried, waiting. Maybe now it was his turn. The day started warm and quiet, too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of stillness Caleb had come to love, but a hushed, stifling silence that pressed against the trees. Even the birds had gone mute. The sky was cloudless, the air thick and unmoving, and every pine needle felt like it was holding its breath. Ranger paced more than usual, nose twitching, hackles rising at sounds only he could hear. Caleb noticed, watching him from the garden. He wiped sweat from his brow and squinted towards the western ridge. Then came the smell. Smoke. Faint at first, like a campfire 2 valleys over, but it grew stronger with each gust of dry wind. Caleb climbed to the lookout post he'd built in the pines above the cabin. From there, he saw it, a dark smear on the horizon, rising into the sky in a thick column of ash and haze. Wildfire, he whispered. The word tasted like metal in his mouth. He slid down from the platform and sprinted back to the cabin, Ranger right behind him. The dog wasn't growling. He was whimpering now, anxious, alert. Caleb didn't panic. He moved with the cold clarity that had only ever shown up when everything was on the line. The emergency stash was already packed, a habit born from the search party scare months before. He tossed it on the bed, then filled every container they had with water. Barrels, pans, pots, even the old coffee can. He soaked burlap sacks, then dragged them outside and laid them along the cabin's walls. Anything flammable within 30 feet was kicked, yanked, or thrown away from the structure. Firewood, fallen leaves, his drying rack of herbs. Gone. He climbed the roof with a bucket, dousing the wooden shingles as best he could. By dusk, the sky had turned orange-grey. Ash began to fall like snow. "We're not leaving," Caleb told Ranger as the dog sat at the door, eyes locked on him. "This is our home." Ranger didn't argue. He simply stood, pressed his head to Caleb's hip for a moment, and then trotted off around the cabin, checking the perimeter like a soldier on duty. The fire came at night. At first it was just a glow in the trees, a flickering wall of orange and black, distant but steady. Then the roar arrived, low and relentless, like a freight train echoing through the woods. Sparks flew in waves, carried by the updraft. Embers rained like angry stars. Caleb ran between flare-ups, stamping out the ones he could. Ranger barked, loud, sharp barks, not panicked but urgent, as he dashed toward another patch of brush that had caught. "Stay back!" Caleb shouted, but the dog wouldn't leave the front lines. They worked side by side, boy and dog, fighting for what they'd built. The wind shifted. Suddenly, the fire surged toward the clearing. It wasn't just embers anymore. It was a moving wall of flame. The garden went first. The plants curled into ash. Then the fence. Then the work shed erupted in a whoosh of heat. Caleb's face blistered as he pulled burning debris away from the porch. He coughed, eyes watering, lungs screaming. Ranger whined behind him, circling the cabin as smoke clouded the air. They couldn't hold it all back. Then the rain came. A crack of thunder rolled through the valley, sharp, loud, violent. And then, water. Fat, cold drops slammed into the earth. Caleb stood still in the middle of the clearing, drenched in sweat and soot, and tilted his face to the sky. The downpour exploded from the clouds like a gift from something watching. The fire hissed, steam rose, the forest breathed. It didn't stop the fire completely. Not yet. But it slowed it. Bought them time. Gave them a chance. Hours passed. The flames eventually retreated, choked by water and starved of fuel thanks to their fire break. Smoke still hung heavy, but the worst had passed. Caleb collapsed on the porch, his legs barely working. Ranger lay beside him, ribs heaving, his fur singed in patches, tongue lolling from his mouth. The cabin had survived. One wall blackened, one window cracked. But it stood. They had done it. Through the haze and wreckage, Caleb looked around. The place was scorched, but not destroyed. The fire hadn't taken everything. The heart of it remained. He turned to Ranger, still lying there, chest rising and falling with labored breaths. "You stayed," Caleb whispered, voice hoarse. Ranger lifted his head just enough to bump his nose into Caleb's hand. "You fought for this place," he said. "You fought harder than I did." A long silence passed, broken only by the distant hiss of water on coals. Then Caleb looked out across what remained, the cabin, the blackened trees, the charred garden, and for the first time he didn't see just a shelter or a hideout. He saw a home, not a place he'd found, but one he'd chosen to defend. And Ranger had chosen it too. In the stillness, Caleb whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "This isn't just where we survived." He looked down at the dog beside him. "This is where we live." The air smelled like pine needles and fresh rain when Caleb closed the leather folder and zipped it inside his pack. Everything he'd spent months preparing was inside that folder. Receipts from Mason's trading post, photos of the cabin before and after the rebuild, handwritten letters from neighbors miles apart, and a detailed journal chronicling 5 years of survival, work, and learning. At 16, he was heading back into the world he had once escaped, not to run from it, but to face it on his own terms. Ranger stood beside him, a little slower these days, but no less alert. His fur had turned grey around the muzzle, and one eye looked cloudier than before. Still, he followed without needing a command. Caleb had packed light, just enough jerky, dried fruit, a few boiled eggs, and water to last 2 days of hiking. The county courthouse was 30 miles away. They left at dawn. The trail down the mountain was familiar, but changed. Trees burned in the wildfire now stood bare like charred ribs. Other places bloomed with wildflowers, fireweed, bloodroot, new shoots from blackened earth. It reminded Caleb of what Mr. Mason once said while cleaning a rusted rifle barrel. Fire doesn't destroy everything. It clears the ground for new things to grow. They slept that night beneath a rocky overhang. Ranger curled close, his warmth comforting against the mountain chill. Caleb held the folder tight as he drifted to sleep, his mind playing and replaying how the next day might unfold. The courthouse sat in the heart of Brookridge, a town Caleb had only seen once from a distance. Civilization looked strange after so long away, buildings too close together, streets paved and buzzing, people walking fast with phones in their hands. Caleb drew stairs. An unshaven teen with a dog at his heel and a pack slung over one shoulder wasn't common sight downtown. But no one stopped him. Not yet. The clerk at the front desk blinked when Caleb explained why he was there. "You're filing for emancipation? On your own?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, steady but respectful. "I have the documents." He handed over the folder, his fingers brushing against the worn leather one last time before letting it go. Ranger sat patiently beside him, drawing a small smile from the woman. "We don't get many of these cases," she murmured, flipping through the contents. Her expression shifted from amused to attentive. "You're serious?" "Yes, ma'am." A hearing was scheduled for 2 days later. The time in between was spent sleeping in a city park on the edge of town, beneath a maple tree near the maintenance shed. Ranger didn't seem to mind. He stayed close, watchful as ever. When the hearing day came, Caleb wore his cleanest flannel shirt, mended jeans, and boots he'd oiled the night before. He sat straight in the courtroom, hands folded, Ranger lying quietly beside the bench. The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and deep eyes, glanced at the dog first before turning to Caleb. "You're a minor," she began, petitioning to be declared an adult. "On what grounds?" "I've lived independently since I was 11. I've earned income through trade and woodworking. I've kept records. I have community witnesses. I grow my own food, maintain a home, and educate myself. You've also been off the grid. No school, no guardian, no legal address. I've survived." He answered, "Not just that. I've built a life, a good one." The courtroom was quiet. Then the clerk handed the judge the folder. She flipped through it slowly. Her eyebrows lifted as she scanned the photos. Before and after shots of the cabin, shelves of canned food, homemade furniture. Letters came next. Mason's, Cal from the Ridge, even Mrs. Dorsey, the honey lady from 3 valleys over. But it was the final envelope that caught her attention. "Who's Hank Evans?" the judge asked. "He passed through last winter." Caleb replied. "He said he was just hiking. He drank coffee by our fire." "He sent a notarized letter," the judge said, holding up the cream-colored page. "Described you and the dog in detail. Called you the most self-reliant soul I've met in 30 years of mountaineering. Said if anyone deserves emancipation, it's you." Caleb blinked. He hadn't known Hank would write anything. The judge leaned back, tapping the folder with her finger. "This is one of the most thorough self-reliance petitions I've seen." she said, then paused. But emancipation is more than proving independence. It means you understand responsibility, the law, the consequences of being on your own in the eyes of the state. I understand, Caleb said softly. And I'm ready. The judge nodded. I believe you. Ranger let out a low, quiet whine, almost like he knew what the words meant. The ruling came with conditions. Caleb had to enroll in the county's GED program and check in quarterly with the social services rep. But the decision was clear. He was now legally recognized as an adult. Then came the second part: land rights. Caleb had discovered that the cabin and surrounding land had been unclaimed for over a decade. With documentation, photos, and witness statements, he'd filed for adverse possession. If approved, it meant the cabin, the garden, the rebuilt shed, all of it, would legally belong to him. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from the county assessor's office. Caleb stood on the post office steps, heart pounding as he opened it. Approved. He read the letter once, then again, barely breathing. When he reached the line that said, Parcel 8B, totaling 37.4 acres, to be titled in the name of Caleb Merrick, he let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He looked down at Ranger. We did it. Ranger thumped his tail, his good ear flicking toward the sound of pigeons nearby, but his eyes never left Caleb's. They walked home slowly, back up the mountain road, the deed folded inside the pack between 2 cedar carvings and a jar of pickled beets from Mason's. Home wasn't just a word now. It was theirs. Officially. Irrevocably. The forest greeted them like an old friend. And as they stepped onto the porch, Ranger paused, sniffed the air, and let out a low, satisfied bark. Not for food, not for strangers, but for the truth. The cabin didn't creak like it used to. Its roof, once a sagging patchwork of tarp and rot, now held tight under spring rains. The floor no longer groaned with every step. Windows gleamed with new glass, and wildflowers framed the porch. But inside, beside the stove that had once saved them from freezing, lay the same dog who had carried Caleb through it all. Ranger. His body had grown thin, legs stiffer, his eyes clouded and slow to follow movement. But his ears still perked at the sound of Caleb's voice, and his tail wagged when the boy, now nearly a man, scratched the familiar spot behind his good ear. Caleb moved through the cabin with purpose, repairing, expanding, preparing. He'd converted the tool shed into a sleeping space for visitors, added a solar panel to charge lanterns and a radio. His woodworking had become known beyond the ridges, traded for supplies, and sometimes gifted in return for stories. The garden stretched wider now, framed by rows of low stone walls and arching grapevines. Chickens clucked from a small coop, rescued from a farm down in Cedar Hollow. The sanctuary was growing. It started with one injured fox left by a park ranger named Mara, who had learned about Caleb through Mason. Then came 2 goats, half-starved and left behind when their owner passed. And last month, a girl named Riley, 15, quiet, and bruised by more than just the world's weather, stepped off a transport van and stared at the mountain like it was something she'd only ever read about. Caleb didn't ask her story. He just handed her a trowel, pointed to the soil, and said, "These tomatoes need someone who talks to them. I can't do it. They don't like my voice." And Riley had smiled, for the first time. It was working. The cabin, the garden, the animals, the silence. It was healing something deeper than wounds. But every evening, no matter how busy the day, Caleb returned to the fire and sat beside Ranger. The dog rarely left his bed now, a cushion Caleb had made from a mattress scrap and thick canvas. Ranger still tried to follow Caleb around the yard, but often made it only a few steps before lying down to rest. His breath had turned shallow, his gaze sometimes distant, as if already part way between here and somewhere else. Caleb knew. The morning it happened, the wind carried the scent of pine sap and earth, sharp and sweet, like the first day of spring. Caleb knelt beside Ranger, who hadn't moved since the night before. His chest still rose and fell, barely. His tail gave one soft thump. Caleb placed a hand gently on his side. "You don't have to keep watch anymore," he whispered. "You did good, buddy." Ranger's eyes blinked once, slow and deliberate, as if to say he knew, and then they closed. The cabin fell quiet in a way Caleb had never heard before. Didn't cry. Not at first. He sat beside his oldest friend for hours, fingers tracing the ridges of fur along his back. When the sun reached its peak, Caleb lifted the dog in his arms, gently, reverently, and carried him out the back door, across the clearing, through the stand of cedar trees Ranger had always favored. Beneath the tallest one, where pine cones scattered like offerings and the earth was soft, Caleb dug the grave. It took all afternoon. He didn't rush. He wrapped Ranger in a blanket he'd sewn years ago for cold nights, placed one of their first carved wood bowls by his side, and a photo, black and white, slightly faded, of them both, taken by Hank that first winter. Then he covered the grave, hands trembling not from effort, but from something deeper. At the head of the mound, he drove a cedar plank into the soil. The lettering had been carved weeks earlier, when Caleb knew the day would come soon. Ranger first friend, forever faithful. He stepped back, hands streaked with dirt and resin, and let himself feel the weight of the years. Not grief alone, but gratitude. Ranger hadn't just been a dog. He'd been the reason Caleb survived, the reason he stayed, the reason this place ever became a home. That night, Caleb lit a small fire and sat on the porch as stars blinked into view. He poured 2 cups of broth, one for him, one for the earth. And as he sat in silence, a breeze passed through the trees, soft and warm, lifting the edge of the blanket on the porch chair beside him. For the first time in his life, Caleb spoke out loud, not to be heard, but to remember. "You saved me. I just built what you made possible." The mountain didn't answer. It didn't need to, and neither did Ranger, because some bonds don't need words. Some homes are built not just from wood or stone, but from trust, loyalty, and the quiet kind of love that never leaves, even after the paw prints fade from the dirt. The gravel crunched beneath the tires of the van as it wound up the final stretch of forest road, sun slicing through the canopy in gold streaks. Caleb stood on the porch of the sanctuary, arms crossed, his frame stronger now at 21, but still bearing the quiet softness of someone who'd lived most of his life among trees, not people. Behind him, Luna sat alert, black and white coat gleaming in the late spring sun. She tilted her head towards the distant sound of the engine, then stood. "They're here," Caleb said simply. The van creaked to a stop. The driver, a counselor from a youth centre 2 towns over, stepped out first, stretching stiff legs. Then the doors opened. 4 kids emerged, none older than 16. 3 kept close together, whispering and glancing nervously at the woods. 1 stayed behind. He was the smallest. Hood pulled low, backpack frayed at the seams, one shoe partially duct-taped together. Caleb's eyes caught the tight grip he had on the strap. His name wasn't on the intake form. The center had said they'd had a last-minute addition. No ID, no parent contact. The boy looked up when Caleb approached, eyes sharp, wary, ready to flee if needed. "What's your name?" Caleb asked gently, not pushing, just offering. The boy's jaw clenched. His voice was barely audible. "Don't got one that matters." Caleb nodded slowly. "Fair enough." Then, after a moment, "Here, we don't need names to heal, just truth." The boy blinked. Something in his posture softened, just barely, but he gave a tiny nod and followed the others. The group was led inside the bunkhouse, warm pine walls, shared kitchen, communal fire pit out back. No forced bonding, no lectures, just space. Caleb's kind of healing had no schedule. That evening, as the fire crackled and the last light faded behind the ridgeline, the teens sat around the pit. Luna lay between Caleb's boots, tail brushing lazily over his foot. He let the silence stretch before he spoke. "I used to be a ghost," Caleb said, voice even. "Lived in a broken-down cabin up that ridge. Didn't have much but a dog with one ear and a rusty hammer." They looked at him. Really looked now. Even the quiet boy. "I thought the world forgot about me. Truth is, I was the one who disappeared." Micah, the boy had whispered it once while brushing the horse's mane earlier, tugged his knees closer to his chest. "But someone taught me something important," Caleb continued. He reached down to pet Luna's head, her ears twitching at the touch. "Home isn't about safety. It's about meaning. It's where you stop running." Later, after the group had settled in their bunks, Caleb stood in the garden, head tilted back at the stars. Luna padded beside him, then sat, ears twitching at the night. "She's different from Scout," Caleb murmured, "but she knows." Behind them, one of the cabin windows glowed faintly. A silhouette passed. It was Micah, moving silently, placing something on the windowsill. Caleb walked back after the boy had gone. It was a hand-carved figure, clumsy, uneven, but unmistakably Luna, ears high, tail mid-wag. Caleb smiled, heart catching in his throat. He hadn't taught carving yet. That had come from watching, from instinct. The legacy was beginning to live beyond him. Not just survival, not just healing, building, and giving back. The porch was quiet, wrapped in a soft mountain dark that felt like a wool blanket pulled over the world. A faint breeze stirred the trees, rustling through the tall grass and scattering the smell of wood smoke and damp cedar across the clearing. Micah sat cross-legged at the edge of the porch, hoodie pulled up, gaze distant. The boy was thinner now, but stronger in a way that didn't show in his arms or shoulders, only in the way he breathed. Not shallow and guarded anymore, not afraid of the night. Luna lay at his feet, head resting on her paws, eyes half closed but alert. Every few minutes her ears flicked, catching a sound only she could hear. An owl's call, a chipmunk scurry, the rhythm of a world still moving. Inside the cabin, Caleb sat at the old wooden table near the fire. The walls were lined with sketches, seed jars, hiking maps, and hand-carved figures of wolves, bears, dogs, each one holding a story. He opened his notebook, the same one he'd carried since he was 14. Some pages were worn thin, smudged with dirt, tears, and blood. Others were crisp, new, filled with the wisdom of mistakes turned into lessons. Tonight he picked up a pen and wrote slowly. He didn't bark for food. He barked for belonging, for healing, for home. He paused, staring at the ink as it dried. Then he looked towards the window. Through the glass, he could just make out Micah and Luna silhouetted by moonlight. He reached over and flicked the small radio to life. Static crackled, then settled into the familiar voice of a late-night podcast host, one who had once read a story about a wild boy and his dog, sent anonymously years ago. "Tonight," the voice said, smooth and low, "we're talking about guardians, not the ones who wear uniforms, the quiet ones, the ones who never give up, even when no one's looking. Not all heroes wear badges. Some wear fur and scars. Some wait at the door until you're ready to come back. What's your story with a loyal pet?" Caleb smiled, the corner of his mouth twitching with something caught between joy and ache. On the porch, Micah leaned back against a beam, and whispered something to Luna. The dog lifted her head, tail giving a gentle sweep across the boards. The boy didn't need to speak loud. Luna always listened. Then he said, almost like an echo, "I think I get it now. Why you stayed. Why you fought." The wind answered by lifting the edge of the blanket around his shoulders. A pine cone rolled across the porch floor and stopped right in front of Luna's paws. She didn't move, just rested her head on it like a pillow. The fire inside the cabin crackled low. Caleb closed the notebook and stepped onto the porch. Micah looked up. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "if they come back somehow? The ones that really mattered?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He stepped off the porch into the clearing, looked up at the stars. "They don't need to," he said finally. "They never really left." Luna got up, stretched, and walked to Caleb's side. She nudged his hand with her nose, the same way Ranger used to. Caleb knelt beside her, whispered, "Still watching, huh?" She pressed her head to his chest in reply. The sanctuary lights glowed softly behind them. In the distance, laughter drifted from the bunkhouse. A girl was teaching another how to use a carving blade. The trees swayed like they were breathing, everything alive, everything moving forward. And beneath the cedar tree where Ranger was buried, the wind stirred the leaves gently. Not loud, just enough to remind the world. Some guardians never leave their post, they just pass the watch to the next one. So as this story ends, maybe yours begins. Tell us, what's your story with a loyal pet? And if this story found you, even in the quietest part of the night, share it, support the next chapter, and help us keep the spirit of these guardians alive. Subscribe to German Shepherd, where stories heal and loyalty lives on.